Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archaeoviking. Today, I'm going to begin covering one of my favorite subjects, and that is the rise of the Chinese empires in the uh, late BCEs and early CEs, or BC and AD, for those of you who don't use that measurement system. And the specific subject of this video is going to be the rise of the Qin Dynasty and the establishment of Chinese imperialism. I'm covering this subject because Chinese imperialism is often sidelined in favor of more Western dynasties like the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire in Ptolemaic Egypt. And while they all certainly deserve their time in the sun for the contributions that they provided to humanity and to the eventual modern world as a whole, these Chinese dynasties arguably have more that they have provided to in terms of contributions to the modern world, and were arguably in many cases larger. So without ado, we're going to go ahead and hop right in. So what is the Qin Dynasty? Well, for one thing, the Qin Dynasty is one of the kingdoms that provided the blueprints, and I use that very specific word very specifically, blueprints for the Great Wall of China. And I'll get into that a little bit later as to why it's only the blueprints, but they are one of the ones who began these ideas of a continuous defensive line or structure. And what the Qin Dynasty was originally, it was a small petty kingdom that was at least nominally a vassal to the capital of the Zhou Dynasty, that ran roughly from 1000 BCE to eventually 200 BCE. And it was situated right here on the Huanghe River. And as you can see, compared to the Qin kingdom, compared to larger kingdoms such as the Liang, which would eventually become the Zhou kingdom itself, Chu and Wu, it was rather small and faced quite a lot of threats from the Chu kingdom in terms of eventually being absorbed by the Chu as well as the Liang kingdom. However, around the 300 BCEs, this began to change. Right around the time that Alexander the Great was pushing into India over here, the king of the Qin Dynasty at the time decided it was time to expand his holdings. And so what he did is he did something very clever and cunning. He sent emissaries into what is modern day Sichuan to the kingdoms of Ba and Shu, who were not vassal kingdoms of the Zhou Dynasty. They have their own independent kingdoms, and told them, look, we have these cows that literally shit gold, and they shit gold so much that they've caked around our hooves. So they eventually were led to believe that that the Qin Dynasty had these cows that literally produced gold every time they ate, and after they began shitting. And so Ba and Shu were like, well, we want some, we'll pay you for some. And the Qin king was like, well, we don't have a way to get to you really in terms of, heavy trade and such. There are no roads. So the Ba and Shu kingdoms began helping the Qin build this road. They gave him the money to build this road that eventually became known as the Stone Cow Road, coming from the Qin Dynasty down here. And so with this road that the Qin Dynasty built that was all being funded by the Ba and Shu kingdoms, the king of Qin was able to march a large army down into Sichuan and conquer Shu and gain the vassalage of the Ba kingdom. And in fact, he began using Ba soldiers who were known for their totem, the white tiger, and were known to be ferocious warriors, as mercenaries. Excuse me. And so after doing that, he was able to expand his holdings from this little small area over here down all the way over here and become not quite as large, but close in size to the Chu Kingdom. And then it would also eventually go on to defeat and gain vassalage of various steppe nomads, such as the Rong and Di, who were proto-Mongolic peoples. But for a while, that expansion of the Qin Kingdom would stall until the king in question's great grandson, Yang Jing, rose into power. And Yang Jing decided it was time that this several hundred years feudal era, the Warring States period, came to an end. And so he began a massive military campaign where he systematically took out the various petty kingdoms, beginning with kingdoms like Han and Zhou, and then Wei, and etc., with Chu and Qi being the last two kingdoms he conquered. In fact, Chu, it is stated that he sent 2 invasion forces. The first was only around 200,000. Of course, you have to take into account possible exaggeration. And then the second one being around 500 to 600,000. And this was due to the first invasion of Chu being unsuccessful. And again, there has to be certain leeway in terms of overestimation and exaggeration. However, even the most conservative estimates, take into account, for example, something that had happened only a couple of centuries earlier in Europe. The Persian Empire invading into Greece is estimated to have had between 100,000 and 300,000 soldiers, accurately, not the 1 million that you see in the movies like 300, invading into Greece. So, to be fair, these numbers aren't, even conservatively aren't that far off. So maybe more like 400,000 than 600,000, and 100,000 versus 200,000. Who knows? But the point is, they were massive armies, and they allowed him to eventually conquer all of China. However, this was not without some error. Multiple assassination attempts were, of course, attempted on on Yang Jing during his conquest. One of the most notable ones was the figure known as Jin Keay, who was sent by, I believe, the state of Wu under the guise of being a diplomat. He was there to sue for peace. But he took out his knife when the emperor tried to reach for it, and he attempted to assassinate the emperor before the emperor was able to draw his sword, as well as the emperor's guards were also able to quickly take note of the situation and put him down. It wasn't very successful. Jin Keay was able to keep the emperor on the defensive for a few minutes, but again, the guards saw it fairly quickly, and Yang Jing was, being a noble, somewhat trained in the arts of the sword and self-defense, so he was able to hold himself off. But finally, after these many years of conquest, he brought this area that you see here under his rule, creating the Qin Empire, which is where we get the name China from. And he could have stopped here. He could have very much stopped here, but he didn't. First, he began a southward expansion into what were known as the various Yue tribes, Da Yue, Non Yue, etc., which were the ancestors of what we would know as the Viet, the Vietnamese people. Eventually, they would be forced to migrate further south. And he sent several armies down there to conquer them. And in fact, eventually, even when the Qin Dynasty became dissolved after the Qin Emperor's death, there still was a petty kingdom down here that had been established by one of the Qin, the first emperor of China's best generals. Another military campaign that was undertaken by the Qin Empire was the pacification of the borderlands on the modern-day Mongolia, China border, because the Xiongnu, or the Huns, had been periodically raiding various border towns and cities, and it became a major issue. So in response to these Hunnic nomads, which, as you can see, this is the size of the Xiongnu Hunnic. Now, to be fair, this is the Han Dynasty, not the Qin Dynasty, but it's roughly the same area, so sue me. The first emperor of China sent his top general, General Ming, to the north, where General Ming began the construction of various forts and defensive walls. Walls meant for defense along the border. However, what makes this different from the Great Walls we know it today is that these fortresses and defensive structures were actually more meant for offense. General Ming built them to provide a foothold for military expeditions into the Eurasian steppe. Because despite common belief, those people who watch movies and such, involving sieges, they occasionally like, well, why didn't they just leave the city alone if it's going to take forever to siege them? Actually, that's not how that works. You need a foothold to defend yourself, and that's exactly it. So while these were for defense, they were more just to provide a base of operations to return to after military campaigns. In fact, these are what would allow, and that I'll have in part 2, the Han Dynasty campaigns as well. The first emperor of China was also well known for building projects such as the Ling-Chu Canal, which allowed him to semi-industrialize the Yue kingdoms that he had brought under his sphere, as well as allowed him to more easily traverse the region, as well as resupply his troops. But that is far from his only accomplishments. With the unification of China, what would become known as China, the first emperor, who had now dubbed himself Qin Shi Huangdi, or the first emperor of Qin, he began to make everything much more unified in China. He standardized the writing you see here, as well as helped develop alchemical medicine. However, much of this alchemical medicine development was for his own ideas of becoming immortal. He didn't like the idea of dying. He wanted to, like many rulers at the time, become immortal. And Taoist alchemists were thought to be the ones who held that secret. And unfortunately, the ways they did it were obviously, in hindsight, counterproductive. Like they would make drinks here of, things like arsenic and other things, and then they would take liquid mercury and freeze them, probably in mountains and other ways, into these orbs where he would eat these mercury orbs. And then eventually probably is what led him to die, drinking the arsenic and eating the mercury orbs. But in response to his dying, or his slow death, as well as the inevitability of death in general, Qin Shi Huang decided it was time to build his tomb, which is this rather large earthen pyramid you see here. No, conspiracy theorists who are watching, this does not mean that aliens or Atlantis or Egypt or whatever helped him build this. It just means that the pyramid is the most simple structure to build with. Anyways, he began ordering the construction of this pyramid, mostly forced construction, because the peasants didn't like having to build this for hours on end. He also broke slightly from tradition, and began making large, life-size terracotta soldiers. And what I mean slightly is traditionally terracotta soldiers were about the size, like, say, of a G.I. Joe action figure. But he figured, at least in his mind, according to accounts, this wasn't enough. He had made a lot of enemies in his life, so he decided to make a literal army of it. I think the estimate is now there's around 10,000-ish terracotta soldiers defending him. There used to be 8,000, but they found more. And none of them are similar. They're all unique. They're all different people. They all have the only unique parts is their arm. And then he also had chariots and carts for his transportation, as well as the weapons for the Terracotta Army were actual weapons. You had actual iron swords and bronze crossbow bolts, as well as bronze and iron dagger axes, which are like a halberd. You'll note that I brought up the development of dagger axes in my video on China is a cradle of civilization. These things were built well after the Bronze Age because they were essentially halberds. And interesting note is all of these weapons had essentially the names of not just the makers, but the names of their supervisors and their supervisors' supervisors on up. So that if a mistake was made, you can immediately find who did it. And what this was part of a practice called legalism. So legalism is the antithesis to Confucianism. Confucianism is the idea that while peasants and the lower class are obligated to follow the ruler, they are only obligated to follow the ruler so long as the ruler is just and virtuous. Confucianism believes that everyone is inherently good, and that you only need to follow somebody so long as they have the best interests of your best interests at heart, and therefore the emperor has to be a good person. Legalism, which is what Qin Shi Huang and the Qin kingdom followed, was essentially everyone is untrustworthy, everyone is wicked at heart, and they need to be deeply and horribly and intensely controlled, and any little mistake is considered a betrayal. This is sort of what led him to burning books. He burnt thousands of books that didn't agree with him. Now, there's some debate that how extensive this burning was, but either way, he did do it. And so that's what happened with this. You don't trust anybody. Well, we're going to micromanage you to the nth plus 1 degree. And if you make a mistake on any of these weapons, you're probably going to be severely punished. So, yeah. And eventually, Qin Shi Huang did die and was placed in his tomb, with many of his aides and many of the builders being killed after the construction of the tomb and buried with it, so that nobody would know where it was. And unfortunately for the Qin Empire, after his death, his son was not the effective ruler that his father was, and so eventually, shortly after, around 208 BCE, a massive rebellion began in the Qin Empire that would eventually lead to the rise of the Han Dynasty, which will come in part 2 at a later date. But despite the tyranny of the first emperor, despite his brutal conquests, without him, or really because of his brutal conquests, without him, without the first emperor of China, without the Qin Empire, however short-lived it was, would not have imperial China as a whole. And so, like I said, in part 2, we will go into the Han Empire. So with that, that finishes our video. Did you learn about any of this in school? Did you know that the Great Wall of China wasn't actually a Great Wall at this point in time? Let me know. And if you want to see any other subjects, me cover any other subjects, feel free to comment. And remember to like, share, and subscribe, and have a good day.